Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to the second session in this series. As we've noted in the first session, this companion book will provide useful background information on the technologies, support, and other factors that can impact your ability to effectively use laboratory informatics systems. For many people, myself included, when we hear the phrase return on investment, we think in terms of financial issues or investing in something that will turn a profit. Aside from commercial testing laboratories and organizations are usually cost centers, not income producing. So what exactly does ROI mean in that kind of a setting? When we look for an answer to that question, we also have to ask, why do we invest in laboratory informatics and automation systems? We do it because there's a need that can't be met otherwise. That tends to boil down to words and phrases like productivity, efficiency, and improving lab operations. Basically, to give us tools to help us get our work done better and at lower cost. How do we structure that investment, and what should we expect as a result? And finally, how do we evaluate the alternatives? While we usually think in terms of return on investment, we need to consider the results of that investment. Because once those investments have been made, the nature of laboratory work will change. The return on those investments is demonstrated by what they enable us to do. We will be spending this session on ROI, but we won't be covering all the details. The rest, additional comments about that subject, will occur throughout the webinar series as we look at issues about the impact of technologies on lab performance and the costs and benefits associated with them. Because most of the people we'll be discussing funding with will think in terms of return on investment, we'll stick with that terminology, but keep considerations about the results of investing in the forefront of your thinking. ROI considerations can come up in different ways. One is when you're evaluating alternative approaches to handling a project. Given choices, which is the most cost-effective and has the highest likelihood of success? Maximizing, or at least ensuring a good return on investment, takes preparation. We'll look at that preparation and how it can be used to gain and justify funding. Another is when you have to actually justify a funding group. Many of the people in that group may not understand much about lab work, but they do understand money and budgets. If they fund your requests, they may not be able to fund other work. You have to make your case in terms that they will understand. You'll also have to convince them that your program is sound from both a fiscal and lab operations management perspective. We need to define what we mean by the word investment. Investments will consist of people and their time, funding for equipment, systems, and planning. Some of the people you will need access to will be from your group as well as other organizations, IT support, for example. Some may be resources you don't currently have. People's time will have to be funded and justified, particularly if there are other projects competing for their attention. Having people understand the nature of the return may be a challenge, again, particularly if lab work isn't familiar to them. It's not as simple to understand as stock market investing, for example, where you invest funds and you expect a return of the same kind. Given the subject we're discussing, the return won't be funds returned on monetary investment. They will be in terms of improving lab operations and performance. As you will see shortly, you have to define what that means for your organization. In order to achieve your investment goals in laboratory work, you may find that you'll be breaking new ground in your company, such as automation of methods, dealing with new technologies, making changes to lab operations, which includes people taking on new roles, such as project management. These are not reasons to avoid the work, but to go in with your eyes open and consider new ways of working. John Trig, formerly of Phase 4 Informatics, gave the following comments in a presentation he gave a few years ago. Defining ROI is one of the big challenges a project faces. It's often based on faith, not data. There's an issue of trust that the decisions are well-founded and researched, and that the direction you're going makes sense both technically and in terms of resource utilization. Time savings are soft dollars. They have to be turned into productive use. If you free up people's time, what are they going to do with it? And will they need more education to get that work done? Often, the investment required is significant, so the organization may have to take a big risk. Large companies may have their own formal ROI process. Those funding projects will be concerned about the costs and whether or not the project has been well thought through. They'll be looking at the benefits they'll get from their investment, and everything comes down to a very simple question. What's the return on the investment? They may have concerns about the likelihood of success of the project. Lab information technology projects have a reputation, sometimes deserved, for cost overruns and schedule issues. How is your project going to be different? How do you go about answering that? We need to look at some points that will help you respond and lay out a realistic approach to deciding what investments to make, when to make them, and then how to justify your programs. How do you go about preparing for funding and project approval requests? Let's assume you're talking to people who don't understand lab work. First, you need to set a clear statement of goals for laboratory work. To you, the goals may seem obvious. To those outside the lab, those reviewing your proposals, they may not be. Having clearly stated goals that they can buy into and use as a reference point for technology programs and projects will make your life a lot easier. You need to have people understand what your lab does and how it affects other parts of the organization. One thing that will help is to put together a story that helps them understand how a lab transitions from one relying on human effort to one using current informatics information technologies. Laboratories rarely start with a high level of systems technologies. They grow into them as needs develop. One of the returns on investment is the development of an overall plan and technology infrastructure that forms a basis for further maturation. Finally, they would like to know, why are you making these investments? What's changed that makes those investments important now? We're going to list some potential goals now and then look at how technologies and planning can impact them. There are goals that your lab has for their scientific mission. They may speak to the nature of the research you're doing or how the QC lab is going to support a production process. The goals referenced here are those that pertain to the use of informatics and automation technologies within those environments. It will be useful as part of both a project's justification and evaluation to see how what you do affects these goals. And these are the goals I'm suggesting. To produce results, it's knowledge, information, and data that are of high quality and integrity, optimizing productivity and ROI, and putting the results of laboratory work in an environment that fosters a high rate of utilization and availability. Basically, effective knowledge and intellectual property management. These are broad statements, in part because there are many different types of laboratories and scientific groups doing different things. Some work is done in a bench setting, some in the field, and some, such as space sciences and astronomy, use really expensive tools for data gathering. In the next few slides, we'll address those goals individually. Producing knowledge, information, and data that is of high quality and integrity might seem obvious, but it's a really hot topic in some fields, particularly life sciences, but that also extends to fields such as economics. Basically, you want people to know that the job of your lab is to produce meaningful results that they can trust and will form a sound basis for decision making. There's a statement in a scientific novel a science fiction novel by Christopher Cantrell that reads, "The only thing worse than no data is data you can't trust." Your lab and those that use the results you produce have to have confidence in its reliability. Another goal is putting the results of the work in an environment that fosters a high rate of utilization and availability. This impacts knowledge and intellectual property management. We should be careful that data and information are organized in ways and formats that can be searched, archived, found, and easy to use. If the data is in a media that is hard to work with, a paper notebook for example, it won't be used, and you won't get the return on investment that work could otherwise produce. Knowledge and intellectual property management has become an important factor in corporate and organizational life. The payback, the return, is making the results of lab work more accessible and useful. When you are making a case for a program or project, you should look beyond the nature of the work done in your lab and see how it impacts other groups. Reducing the cost per test and speeding up the testing process in quality control labs can mean faster product releases and give you the ability to tackle needed projects that may be pushed aside for lack of time or people. It could also mean earlier detection of problems and reducing the amount of out-of-spec mature products that are being produced. If you work in a lab that supports research, how would those research projects benefit from faster, lower-cost analysis? And in research settings, what would streamlined operations mean to furthering your programs? Those considerations are part of the return on investment. The use of lab technologies can improve the processes that are used to conduct your work. There is a progression from manual to semi-automated to fully automated systems. In each case, there's a cost per experiment to consider. Manual work is expensive, but people are easily adaptable to change, particularly when methods may be updated frequently, or there's a low demand for some types of testing. Some stages may be easily automated and offload people, reducing the cost and increasing the throughput. Fully automated systems are least costly to run on a per sample basis, have a sizable upfront cost for implementation, and are the least adaptable. So what are the trade-offs in your work? It may vary from one experimental setup to another. How is your data and information managed? You may be moving from a paper-based environment, say lab notebooks and instrument data system printouts, for example, and to an electronic environment where lab is more easily accessed and used. That can have a significant productivity gain, as well as improved knowledge management. How are workflows managed? Is it a manual process based on paper records? How does that get done now? And what are you planning for in the future? What problems are you having? How will moving to LIMS, for example, change that? You'll get a higher level of efficiency and may be able to reassign someone from clerical or administrative tasks to more productive work. How are the work results reported? Taking advantage of electronic systems, reports can be sent out via email so that people will see them faster, wherever they are. If you are in a QC production environment, the test results can be automatically entered into a production management system, providing faster data entry and better systems integration. How is the lab's knowledge, information, and data integrated with corporate organizational and knowledge intellectual property systems? We touched on this earlier. Instead of just having a paper record, you have an electronic media-based copy that can be integrated with other corporate intellectual property, including corporate-wide research databases, manufacturing production systems. This would relieve the need for manual data entry and filings and speed up downstream data analysis work. Excuse me. Some of the benefits from making investments can be summarized as follows: avoiding new hires, improved data and information quality, helping meet regulatory requirements, streamlining lab operations, higher productivity, which can be measured in more samples per hour or person, faster research and reducing paperwork, better information and knowledge management, more effective integration with internal and external groups, improving your ability to work with lab information and knowledge. In addition, the effective planning and use of informatics and automation technologies will improve your ability to absorb future increases in lab work and your ability to take on more demanding tasks with a lower investment that might otherwise be required. Some of the investment will be for infrastructure, providing a foundation for the transition from largely manual operations to a computer-controlled, computer-assisted, or scientific manufacturing and production facility. This is similar to other settings where productivity gains were found after the transition from manual to automated operations were made. The extent of this investment will depend upon the technological maturity of your group and the resources available to them. We'll take a look at some of these points in the next few slides. We use the block diagram below to introduce informatics technologies and their relationship to each other. The diagram on the right is another way of showing these relationships. The lower light gray box shows the operations that occur on the lab bench. Above that are lab-wide informatics systems, including office applications, and then communications to the rest of the organization, including other laboratories, administrative services, and production if you're in a manufacturing facility. A couple of slides ago, we used three terms: computer-controlled experiments, computer-assisted lab work, and scientific manufacturing and production. We use this diagram to show how they relate to each other. Computer-controlled lab work occurs on the lab bench, or areas where sample handling, processing, and analysis take place. Some instruments, or some investments, can show a fast payback. For example, adding an autosampler to an instrument and thus relieving a person from having to handle sample injections. Some autosamplers have sample processing capabilities that can further increase productivity. However, care has to be taken when planning for these changes. First, the new system would have to be revalidated, and any new components would have to be qualified for use. Second, it would also have to be tested against the older implementation to determine if there are any changes in the process or the results. These are just 2 points of concern. Robotics for sample preparation is another area where gains can be made once the engineering for process changes is done and the resulting system is thoroughly evaluated. This has been particularly effective in life sciences applications where microplates can be used for sample handling. The same equipment can and should be usable in other application areas and industries. As part of the investment ROI evaluation, you also have to determine how long the experimental process will be in use and whether the cost for engineering, evaluation, and equipment is worth the effort. A fully automated process could be run for long periods of time, but would require someone to monitor the system and its performance, essentially a quality control effort on the process. A fully automated system would provide better predictability for materials usage and offer more consistent and reproducible data. The benefits for investments in automation at this level are productivity, that is, the potential for faster throughput, an option for 24/7 operations for fully automated systems, better quality data with lower variability for duplicates, and better control over the process. For fully automated systems, the ability to integrate downstream data entry through instrument data systems, for example. The investment in optimizing a process has some cost associated with it, depending upon the nature of the changes, aside from the cost of the optimization itself. When going from one phase of automation to another, you have to test for and account for any variations in the process and their impact on analysis results. This will likely require revalidation of the process. Automating sample preparation and instrument data processing will get you productivity improvements, but then what happens to the final results? Are they printouts? Do you wind up with multiple systems to manage? This may not meet intellectual property and data management goals. This is an opening for improvements in ROI in the future. We'll come back to this when we discuss planning. The computer-assisted lab work consists of software systems that supplement or augment people's ability to work. Here we find the expected application of LIMS, ELNs, office applications, and so on. I've also included laboratory execution systems here. The point of laboratory execution systems is to help people carry out lab work, but doesn't heavily engage with instrumentation, although it may provide data entry capability. LIMS and ELNs do have automated data capture capability, but again, we'll get to that in the planning section. The benefits for these investments at this level are productivity again, less administrative work, automatic reporting and processing, faster analysis to results, and it facilitates analysis, searching, and so on. Better results in information management are also included. If we take the testing and experimental process from the initial sample to the final result and create a streamlined process that includes sample preparation, processing, data collection and analysis, and the results entry into a LIMS or ELN, you have an automated production operation called scientific manufacturing and production. It's a result of the optimization of all the tasks and processing that go into laboratory work. Each test or experiment has its own production line, all terminating into the ELN or LIMS as appropriate. The overall logic behind it is the same as any production process optimization, with a goal of high-quality products, in this case, data and information, at minimal cost. Is this possible or realistic? And the answer is yes. It does require extensive planning, and this is part of the change in thinking that needs to take place in the nature of laboratory work. That change has been going on steadily as automated instruments and tasks have been introduced into lab work. We'll look at some of the points of concern in the next slide, but there is one thing to consider. Given the move to integration of inline testing and production, isn't this the direction we're already taking? There are three areas we need to look at. First of all, is it technically feasible? Second, is there a need or justification for a project like this? And third, are lab personnel capable of handling these kinds of systems? Process analysis is just one key point. We need someone who's qualified for this work, who can study the process and see if there are any technical roadblocks to automating the system. Those roadblocks can include equipment issues, materials handling, and so on. Another point is standardization of equipment. Unless you have a lot of funding and a significantly acute need, you're going to have to rely on commercially available equipment for the project. Applications where this can be successful today are those where the analysis is based on microplate technologies and standardized sample vials, similar to those used in autosamplers. In order to justify the project, you're going to need a growing sample processing load that will be in place long enough with a stable process to justify the development and equipment costs. As part of the analysis, you should consider intermediate stages of automation that might satisfy the need in the short term until there is a justification for a larger project. Part of those costs will include the need to revalidate the system and ensure that the results produced are in line with previous processes. Personnel issues are a major consideration. Do the people you're working with have the education necessary to deal with the changing nature of their work and manage the points on the right? This would represent a significant shift in work from manually conducted experiments. That background and that experience would be very useful in understanding the automated process and ensuring that systems are operating properly. One point that needs careful consideration is that of detecting anomalies. In many instrument data system combinations, the scientists or lab technician may not see the actual instrument data output, but rather relies on the printed report. That can be a problem because the report is a result of a filtered analysis process and may overlook contaminants or things that just might not look right to an analyst looking at the instrument data. If we're going to embark on programs like this, the automated analysis is going to have to be rigorously designed to look for problems and flag them. If laboratory work is going to move in a direction like this, we're going to have to spend time analyzing systems and preparing people to work in this new environment. That work will start at the development of the experimental process. If the procedures being considered for automated implementation in the future, the manual version should be designed in a way that the transfer from manual to semi-automated to fully automated is planned for at the start. The procedures documentation should include a list of critical points that need to be paid attention to, recommendations for equipment, where automated steps should be considered, and potential risks. If this sounds a lot like traditional production manufacturing, like the production and manufacturing of products, that's pretty much the point. Those systems matured to the way they are as a result of optimizing throughput, product quality, and cost. Those are the same goals for the production of laboratory results. The main difference is that instead of creating things for commercial sale, you're using the results of the work to answer research questions and support materials production processes. The benefits of scientific manufacturing operations include all of those of the computer-controlled and computer-assisted laboratory work: improved data quality, streamlining operations, effective management of lab results, and the ability to integrate lab results with other parts of the organization. Whether or not this is attractive depends on the points just covered and our ability to answer them. It also depends on the availability of people to do laboratory work. If the workload outstrips the available human resources, this may become a necessity. In some fields, this is already a concern. As we've seen in this discussion, the return on investment is going to be demonstrated by the impact those investments will have in changing and improving lab operations and people's ability to work and produce results. Faster processing, better quality results, and the ability to put those results to wider use as part of the organization's intellectual property. Those improvements, in turn, are going to have a beneficial effect on the group that needs work with them. Return on investments is a complex issue that depends on setting meaningful goals. Depending upon the type of lab you're working in, the results may be real currency, but in most cases, it'll be soft currency. Currency that is realized at optimizing lab operations and its contribution to the overall organizational effectiveness. If you're looking at isolated investments to solve fix-the-bottleneck issues, or are looking for limited task-oriented purchase, your case may be simple to make. The downside of that methodology is that you'll find that as your needs grow, particularly if they include informatics technologies we've already covered, you may find yourself either boxed in by previous purchases or having to scrap earlier work and start all over again. One way of avoiding this is to do a lab-wide plan first, and then if you purchase individual components, make sure that they fit the plan so that the pieces come together at the end. This chart may be difficult to view as part of the presentation, but it will be included with the downloadable PDF. If you need a larger copy, give me a call or send me a note and I'll send it to you. The key to getting a good return on investment is planning and education, and we'll begin to cover those points in the next session, which is scheduled right now for January 18th, 2018. So that's pretty much the subject of ROI. Are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Joe, for your presentation. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up for any questions to the group that you may have regarding the information that Joe covered here, or any other questions that just might be on your mind. Feel free to go ahead and type those into the chat window. While you may take some time to go ahead and provide some of those questions in there, I am going to go ahead and provide a link to a resource that Joe has if you are interested in some more technical details of laboratory technologies. So let me just go ahead and share that in the chat window with you all. Okay, and I'm going to now include the link. There you go. Okay. So I'm not seeing any questions so far, but maybe people are still thinking, so that's perfectly fine. But Joe, can you tell us a little bit more about how important it is for lab data and information integration with the rest of the organization? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, one of the problems that's come up, or actually it's been a problem for a long time, is that laboratories have been viewed as kind of a side issue when it comes to information management and technology management. MI or information technology groups will build large databases of customers, for example, or products. But when it comes to the stuff that goes on in the lab, they haven't got any idea what to do with it. Uh, but lab data represents a very significant investment in time, money, and is a very valuable commodity. And as companies try to bring that data into with the rest of the corporate information, they find it's really useful and really beneficial to get that done. The problem becomes really acute in research applications, particularly if you have multiple labs on different campuses where people may be working on similar problems. The need to bring all that stuff together into one spot avoids duplication of effort and not spending the same money twice.
Very interesting. Seems like a lot to consider there. Now, many of your comments seem to apply to regulated labs. What about non-regulated laboratories? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, the regulated versus non-regulated laboratory is an interesting problem. You'll find people, for example, doing discovery research in life sciences who will look at lab work and said, well, we're not regulated. There's a lot of things we don't have to do. My perspective is different. The things that you find in regulations, the guidelines, for example, in ISO 17025, as well as GLPs and GMPs, are really guidelines for how laboratories should work. How to get laboratory work done, how to make sure that the results are of a high quality. The difference between regulated and non-regulated non-regulated laboratories is not so much the kind of work that's being done, because really the same work is necessary, including validation of equipment and processes. It's a question of who does the enforcement. In non-regulated labs, the enforcement would be done by people in the laboratory themselves or in management groups. In regulated laboratories, work is done by the agencies that may be either the FDA, international groups, or so on.
Great. Thanks for answering that question. It looks like we might have someone submitting a question here, so we'll wait a few seconds here to see if anything comes through. While we maybe wait for any questions, are there any other announcements or details that you want to ask the group? I know that you're continuing to develop this webinar series, and maybe you're interested in any ideas for future sessions.
Let's see. There's a question.
Oh, yes, that question now came through. Okay, so we'll come back to that, Joe. Dennis asks, can you comment on the need for a support structure, or the amount of effort needed for ongoing maintenance post-implementation of a LIMS system.
Yeah, I'm having a little problem hearing you. I'm not quite sure what happened. Something happened in the sound. I'm having trouble hearing things. All right, as far as the need for support post limbs, there is ongoing need for things such as updates, changes, adding equipment. It's a fairly significant effort, and someone has to take that fairly seriously. And it's more than just the typical IT people. The IT people are going to be concerned with whether or not the computer systems are working and the operating systems. They may not be able to get involved very well with the actual LIMS application itself. So as things change, as testing is added, these things need to be done very carefully. They need to be documented so that they meet all validation requirements, and that somebody doesn't make a change that doesn't screw something else up. We'll be talking about this to a large extent in the next session, and also in the planning sessions. So you do need a serious support structure, and one of the things that we've been pushing for is the development of a position called laboratory technology management, which would have the ability to bridge the gap between the laboratory people and the IT structures.
Okay, so that seems like it's a gateway into a future session there. Okay, I hope that answers your question, Dennis. Okay, I think it does. Okay, wonderful. Okay, so Joe, I don't see any other questions. We'll wait here a few more seconds to see if anything comes through, of course. But are there any other announcements you may want to make to the group before we start to close out today's webinar?
Just again, if you have any questions that pop up after the session's over, feel free to send me an email. My email address is on the slides. If you are interested in the book, it's well worthwhile getting. And if you are interested, there will be copies of the slides and the scripts that will be posted in the next week or two.
Okay, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, Joe, and thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us here today. I know you all have busy schedules. As a reminder, we will be sending a follow-up to everyone registered with a link to the recording as well as the slides, and we'll be sending some additional information regarding the next webinar session, part 3. And if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and reach out to Joe. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.